back. We are going to continue here with slide 23. We're talking about prohibition. So, just a recap of where we are. Um, we introduced the Roaring Twenties. We talked about the effects that things like the automobile, the radio, and the development of movies have had on culture. Um, Now, we're going to talk about a more interesting topic in prohibition. During the 1920s, people believed that some abused and spent their money on alcohol instead of on their families. So let's just take a step back and look at where we are. We have all these new entertainment sources with radio, movies, music, all of this. The automobile allows us to go back and forth to places. But there's one thing, there's one vice, and that was alcohol. Alcohol was a fairly new uh, form of entertainment to Americans. Um, it was something that gave people um, a lot of things to do, um, but also it created a lot of issues. People would go to bars and they would consume alcohol, and they would consume alcohol at home. We'll talk about some of the criminals and some of the crime that came out of Prohibition also. But during this time, people were really unhappy at how a lot of Americans were spending their money, spending their time, and we're not taking advantage of some of the more clean opportunities that they had for entertainment. So America began calling for prohibition. Prohibition is a complete ban on the sale of alcohol. So what I want you to do in the causes box, I want you to type this whole slide. This is kind of the cause of prohibition. So again, you can pause it, type this down, or write this down, type it on the digital copy, however you want to do. But we are going to move on to the next slide. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed. The 18th Amendment basically just outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol in the United States. So it was a complete ban. And this was an amendment. This was a constitutional amendment that was passed by the United States government to outlaw manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Great idea. Ban it, right? It's against the law now. People will stop doing it. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case. Much like a lot of things that you see today, people were unhappy, and there were lots of disadvantages to prohibition. Remember, prohibition is the absolute ban of the sale of alcohol. The first disadvantage, and you're going to write these, we have three of them. Criminals known as bootleggers began bringing in alcohol from other countries, or they would even make it illegally. We are all residents of a state. Well, most of us are residents of the state of Virginia. You can travel out west into Western Virginia, the western part of Virginia, and it's really common to hear stories about kind of the origin of bootlegging happening for some part of the United States out in Western Virginia. There's actually an entire movie, a Hollywood motion picture that was based on the bootlegging alcohol out in Western Virginia. So that's one disadvantage. One disadvantage was that, and you might say, well, why is this isn't necessarily a disadvantage? But what happened was a lot of stuff began getting mixed in this alcohol, and so it wasn't pure. It wasn't safe and healthy for people to drink. A lot of people ended up dying because of this. They would get it from other countries, or they would make it themselves, and it wasn't a pure process. It wasn't safe, and it wasn't regulated. So nobody really knew what they were drinking at times when they were getting it from these bootleggers. The second disadvantage is that bootleggers sold alcohol illegally in speakeasies. So we'll talk a little bit more about what speakeasies are later on. But basically, what they would do is they would sell the alcohol illegally to these bars and these nightclubs and these music places. And kind of the same thing would happen. People would get really sick, people would die. And it was also taken away from the American economy. So make sure that you have those two written down. And then finally, the third disadvantage was gangsters, crime, and violence rose. So remember, going back, we thought it was a great idea to pass this constitutional amendment to ban the total sale, alcohol, transport, or sale, um, manufacturing, and transportation of alcohol. Crime drastically rose after after prohibition began. Al Capone, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are pretty familiar with Al Capone. Gangster from Chicago, made $105 million a year smuggling alcohol. So it was a huge scene in the underground, um, bringing it back and forth and everything like that. So really big issue um, there. There's a video here. I'm going to post the link because you all can't watch it yet until you have a copy of this. But pretty good video, just a quick short video that kind of goes through the different stages of prohibition in the United States. And then in 2000, or I'm sorry, not 2000, 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, and it was to end prohibition and the 18th Amendment. So let's think about it. This is going to be another discussion board question that you'll need to respond to. Why do you think that prohibition failed? Why do you think prohibition failed? We have the causes of prohibition. We have the effects of it. So you have three different effects. Think about those effects and kind of put it all together, and come up with your opinion on why you think that prohibition failed during this time. Again, that'll be a discussion question, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all's answers. So, very short lesson today um, about prohibition, but that's a very important part of the Roaring Twenties.